Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Now we get into BCCI's bribery. Bribery was a key component of BCCI's strategy for asset growth worldwide from the earliest days of the bank. In some cases, the recipients of funding from BCCI may not have considered the payments to be bribes, but simply a mechanism by which BCCI obtained what it wanted from an official, and in return, the official helped BCCI, such as BCCI's payments to 2 of the Gulf emirs in return for the use of their names as nominees for the purchase of First American. Other cases, the bribes were naked and direct quid pro quos, such as BCCI's payments to central bank officials in return for central bank deposits in countries like Peru. In other cases, BCCI made campaign contributions to politicians, such as it did with General Zia in Pakistan and Carlos Andres Perez in Venezuela. Sorry if I get any of those names wrong. In still other cases, BCCI's payments came in the guise of charitable contributions and provided BCCI with an untraded general deposits from others, as in the case of President Jimmy Carter. Among the Americans who BCCI provided with financial assistance in addition to Carter were US Ambassador to the United Nations Andrew Young, Bert Lance and Jesse Jackson. Abroad, important figures with extensive contact with BCCI included former British Prime Minister James Callaghan, then United Nations Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar, Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seager, Antiguan Prime Minister Lester Bird, a large number of African heads of state, and many Third World central bank officials. The courting of important governmental and political figures was a task ordinarily undertaken directly by Abedi, usually with considerable secrecy. Typically, a local BCCI official would make contact with a key national political figure, who would then be passed on to Abedi. Abedi would then assess that official's needs and try to put together a transaction suitable to the official's status and needs. In some cases, Abedi would not make a bribe per se, but would instead use BCCI's resources to build goodwill, which he in turn would then make use of to generate assets elsewhere. This was Abedi's approach, for example, with President Jimmy Carter, who received millions of dollars in BCCI funding for charitable activities, and then travelled with Abedi to developing nations, providing Abedi with entry to their leaders, and often to assets of their central banks. Abedi used a similar approach with Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young, both of whom had business expenses paid for by BCCI and either solicited business for BCCI in return or offered to do so. When it came to General Noriega, bribes were unnecessary as BCCI provided the far more important service of laundering some $23 million of his money and keeping it safe from other governments and his eventual successors in Panama by ensuring its disappearance following his indictments. But to demonstrate BCCI's hospitality, the bank still made sure that it provided Noriega with an expensive gift, a 25,000 Persian carpet hand-delivered with Abedi's regards to Noriega by Aladdin Sheikh. In other cases, BCCI, however, would make direct payments to key officials, sometimes in suitcases filled with cash. As BCCI officer Abdur Sakir stated in interviews with subcommittee staff, quote, Abedi's philosophy was to appeal to every sector. President Carter's main thing was charity, so he gave Carter charity. Pakistani President Zia's brother-in-law needed a job, he got a job. Bangladeshi President Asharif's mistress needed a job, she got a job. Admission of your son to a top college, he would arrange it somehow. End quote. According to Sakir, there was a world of wide list of people who were in the payoff of BCCI. It was my understanding this included the family of Indira Gandhi, Ashad of Bangladesh, and General Zia. In Africa, most of the leaders of Africa in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mugabe, and others were all understood to have received money. End quote. According to both Shakir and BCCI's Paris manager Nazir Chenoy, BCCI official Aladdin Sheikh would sometimes take cash to people at Abedi's request. Both officials stated that they understood that Nigerian central bankers were paid off in cash by Mr. Sheikh at a World Bank meeting in Seoul, Korea. Chinoy said that such payments were typically made in great secrecy, but that it was obvious to him and others at BCCI what was going on. He described one such apparent payment by Abedi to President Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Quote, I accompanied Mr. Abedi and Mr. Sheikh to the opening of a joint venture with Zimbabwe. I believe that to get permission to open that venture, money was paid to President Mugabe and to Nkomo. The basis I'm making this statement was that when I went there with Mr. Sheikh, I was acting as Mr. Abedi's personal assistant or secretary. When Mr. Sheikh went off on his own to see Nkomo, who was the chief opposition at that time, and then he went off to see President Mugabe. And when they talked, they wanted me out of the room. A number of us were there for the opening, but only Sheikh and Abedi left in the room with those two political figures. Otherwise, I was accompanying him and acting with him. Sheikh carried a bag with him. At the time, I had suspicion that you don't get permission as a foreign bank so easily without a payment. Without favours, it wouldn't be so easy to get a bank that fast, especially given the opposition of the British banks who were already established there, and I can think of no other reason for the exclusion of everyone but Sheikh and Abedi. End quote. The New York District Attorney's indictment of BCCI alleged that in 1986 and 87, BCCI President Abedi and number 2 official Swali Nakvi opened a bank account in a Swiss bank in Panama to transmit bribes and kickbacks in the amount of a percentage of the deposits maintained by the Central Reserve Bank of Peru to the two senior officers of that bank, in a total amount of $3 million in return for Peru maintaining large central bank deposits in BCCI. These bribes were paid following a meeting involving BCCI officials and Peruvian President Alan Garcia. According to BCCI official Akbar Bilgrami, the purpose of the meeting was to make sure that President Garcia would not undercut the decision by the central bank, and that if the payments were made to the central bankers, BCCI would indeed receive the Peruvian deposits in return. Upon returning from Peru, Shifi told Bilgrami that Garcia had given his blessing to the transaction. Chinoy contended that BCCI was simply efficiently exploiting the prevailing business practices in many of the countries in which it had operated, suggesting that in Nigeria and many other African countries it was not possible to do business without buying presents, giving kickbacks, or making bribe to officials. Commission means kickback. The government approves a $300 million contract. The multinational corporation agrees with the government, which has helped him. 10% gets kicked back. A company is established abroad, or they nominate a cousin or someone who is paid 3%. It is known as a commission, but it is actually a kickback. It is the only way to do business. Now we come to BCCI's support of terrorism and arms trafficking. BCCI's support of terrorism and arms trafficking developed out of several factors. First, as a principal financial institution for a number of Gulf sheikhdons with branches all over the world, it was a logical choice for terrorist organisations who received payment at BCCI London and other branches directly from Gulf state patrons and then transferred those funds wherever they wished without apparent scrutiny. Secondly, BCCI's flexibility regarding the falsification of documentation was helpful for such activities. Finally, to the extent that pragmatic considerations were not sufficient of themselves to recommend BCCI, the bank's pan-Third World and pro-Islam ideology would have recommended it to Arab terrorist groups. Arms trafficking involving BCCI included the financing of Pakistan's procurement of nuclear weapons through BCCI Canada, as documented in the Parvez case involving a Pakistani who attempted to procure nuclear-related materials financed by BCCI through the United States. In a November 22, 1991 letter to the subcommittee, the CIA stated that the agency did have some reporting as of 1987 on BCCI being used by Third World regimes to acquire weapons and transfer technology, but was unwilling to elaborate on the nature of this activity in public. In early August 1991, the committee was provided with documents from the Latin American and Caribbean Region Office, LACRO, of BCCI describing the offer for sale by the Argentine Air Force of 22 Mirage aircraft for $110 million. The planned sale was to have been made to Iraq as part of Saddam Hussein's massive military build-up prior to the Gulf War. BCCI was acting as the broker for the transaction, which was to take place in August or September of 1989, but not completed as a result of a dispute within the Argentine military itself. Arms sales involving BCCI from Latin America to the Middle East remain, as of April 1992, under active investigation by US law enforcement. Now we come to the training of cartel death squads. In April 1989, a network of Israeli arms traffickers operating out of Miami made a shipment of 500 Israeli-manufactured machine guns through the Caribbean island of Antigua for the use of members of the Medellin cartel. Later, one of those weapons was used in the assassination of Colombian president candidate Luis Carlos Galán, and several other of the weapons were found in the possession of cartel kingpin Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha after his death in a firefight with Colombian drug agents. The principals in the arms trafficking included Ye Clen, who had previously been identified in Colombian drug enforcement documents as involved in training paramilitary squads for the cocaine cartel in Medellin, Pitchis Shahar, an Israeli intelligence operative, and Morris Sarfati, an Israeli businessman operating out of Miami and Paris. The scandal broke after a broadcast by NBC News on August 21st of 1989 about Klein's activities, and a judge charged Klein with having engaged in criminal conspiracy and training the private armies for the cartel. In the months that followed, the scandal extended to Antigua as well, an island with no substantial military force and no need for the 500 machine guns its foreign minister ordered from Israeli Military Industries, or IMI. Subsequent investigations of the affair, including one by the government of Antigua conducted by a Washington attorney, Loris Barcella, left many questions unanswered. However, it became clear that the Antigua project had been the outgrowth of the establishment of a melon farm by Sarfati in Antigua in 1983, financed by the United States government through a $2 million loan from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, in part on the basis of financial references for the principles provided OPIC by BCCI. Before providing the $2 million to Mr. Sarfati for his melon farm, OPIC requested financial references. Sarfati provided references from his principal bank, BCCI Miami. In a letter from its Miami office, BCCI advised OPIC on June 14th of 1983 that Sarfati, who is one of our valued customers, had a number of major accounts with BCCI. Ultimately, OPIC lost its entire investment in the melon farm and concluded that it had been defrauded by Sarfati. After filing suit against Sarfati, OPIC sold its remaining interest in the melon farm at a loss of 50 cents on the dollar to an Israeli businessman, Bruce Rappaport, and an entity owned by him called the Swiss American Bank. Rappaport, a confidant of former CIA Director William Casey, was in this period also in frequent contact with BCCI's original US contact Bert Lance. Coincidentally, one of BCCI's principal board members, Alfred Hartman, who is also chairman of BCCI's secretly owned Swiss affiliate BCP, also sat on the board of another of Rappaport's banks. In 1990, when the subcommittee sought records pertaining to Mr. Sarfati from BCCI, it was advised by lawyers for BCCI that the Satifari accounts at BCCI were missing. Additional investigative work later located most of the accounts pertaining to one of Sarfati's partners in the Antigua venture, Haim Palani, but the accounts of Sarfati and his businesses remained lost. BCCI Latin American and Caribbean region, LACRO, documents now maintained at the Federal Reserve in Miami document millions in BCCI loans to various Sarfati businesses. Now we come to BCCI and BNL. BCCI was also involved with the Banco Nacional del Larovo, BNL, Italy's biggest bank, whose Atlanta office was involved in a scheme to provide as much as $4 billion in fraudulent loans to facilitate illegal arms sales for the government of Iraq. In March of 1991, 3 officials from BNL were indicted. Although much about the relationship between the two banks remains unclear, BCCI documents in the United States show that BCCI loaned short-term at least, often overnight, its substantial US surpluses to BNL in Atlanta with transactions amounting to billions of dollars a year. While such lending from a bank with a surplus to another bank that could use the assets would be normal, what was not normal about the transaction was BCCI taking funds from its overseas branches for overnight use by BNL. BCCI and BNL shared a key figure in common, that being Alfred Hartman, who was on the board of directors of both banks and the head of BCCI's secretly controlled Swiss affiliate, Banco de Commerce et Placements, BCP. Ironically, when BCCI was closed, its Swiss affiliate was almost immediately sold to a Turkish banking group, Kakarova, whose subsidiary Intrade was BNL's partner in the illegal arms sales from the US to Iraq and part of the federal investigation into BNL. BCCI's prostitution. BCCI's involvement in prostitution arose out of its creation of its special protocol department in Pakistan to service the personal requirements of the Al Nahyan family of Abu Dhabi and on as-needed basis. Other BCCI VIPs, including the families of other Middle Eastern rulers. Several BCCI officers described the protocol department's handling of prostitution to Senate investigators in private, and 2, Abdur Sakia and Nazar Chenoy, confirmed their general knowledge of the practice and testimony. The prostitution handled by BCCI was carried over from practices originally instituted by Abedi at the United Bank when working with a woman, Burgam, I'm going to butcher this name, Asghari Rahman. He cemented his relationship with the Al Nahyan family through providing them with Pakistani prostitutes. Among BCCI bank officials in Pakistan, Begum Rahman was reputed to have in United Bank first won the favours or attention of the royal family by arranging to get virgin women from the villages from the ages of 16 to 20. Rahman would make payments to their families, take the teenaged girls into the cities, and there taught them how to dress and how to act, including the correct mannerisms. The women would then be brought to the Abu Dhabi princes. For years, Rahim would take 50 to 60 of the girls at a time to large department stores in Lahore and Karachi to get them outfitted for clothes. Given the size of Rahim's retinue and her spending habits, 100,000 at a time was not unusual when she was engaged in outfitting her charges. Her activities became notorious in the Pakistani community generally, and there was substantial competition among clothers and jewelers for her business. According to one US investigator with substantial knowledge of BCCI's activities, some BCCI officials have acknowledged that some of the females provided some members of the Al Nahyan family were young girls who had not yet reached puberty and in certain cases were physically injured by the experience. The official said that former BCCI officials had told him that BCCI also provided males to homosexual VIPs. Now we get into BCCI's intimidation of witnesses. After his experience with the nationalisation of the United Bank in Pakistan, Abedi never forgot the ability of governments to destroy his creations. Bribery and prostitution were two techniques to discourage government inquiry. Intimidation of potential witnesses and whistleblowers was quite another. Throughout investigations of BCCI, would-be BCCI whistleblowers have expressed fears for their lives, including Noriega's BCCI banker Amjad Awan, who told Senate investigator Jack Blum that he would be killed if the details of the limited information he gave the Senate about BCCI were revealed. A second former BCCI official who was a source of Blum, and the two BCCI officials who ultimately testified before the Senate in 1991, Masahur Rahman and Abdur Sakia. Both Rahman and Sakia left BCCI in 1990 together with a few others from the bank in the period when Abu Dhabi was taking active control of BCCI and forcing out those of the original Pakistani group who lacked close ties to the Al Nahyan family. Sorry if I get that name wrong. These departures came at an especially vulnerable time for BCCI, and the threats to them should they break the code of silence left nothing to the imagination. In the testimony of Abdur Sakia, formerly the BCCI official in charge of Latin America and the Caribbean, quote, "When I left the bank in April of 1990, we left as a group. About 12 of us. Each one was told, you go quietly, if you make any noise, they're going to fix you. I got word from NACV's secretary that if I made any noise, Altman's firm will get me involved in a drug case." End quote. In the account of Masahur Rahman, quote, "I left. Since then, my family and I have been hounded. All sorts of direct and indirect threats have been used, to the extent that Scotland Yard got to know about it and the Guildford police got to know about it. And they had special security put around our house and special equipment put in the house for direct access to the police station. And my wife and children were suffering greatly. They were being terrorized by these situations, and my wife was having to put the children under the bed every night for fear of some physical violence or some gunshots." End quote. It had long been part of BCCI internal law that erring Pakistani officers in Pakistan would wind up having an accident if they talked about BCCI when they left. In the United Kingdom, another senior BCCI executive, John Hilberry, had told Rahman that there had been a gunshot through his window shortly after he left the bank. As a result, Hilberry decided he would not go to court against BCCI to assert any claims against his former employer, but would simply quietly withdraw. During the Tampa money laundering case against BCCI, information was received through government sources about potential plans to try to affect the government's case by kidnapping witnesses. Moreover, in that same case, BCCI retained private investigators to investigate the customs agents who had brought the case against BCCI, with the investigators ultimately destroying the business of a key informant who assisted in the prosecution of the case. As Chief Undercover Customs Agent Robert Mauser testified, quote, "BCCI had in fact retained another investigative firm for the sole purpose of investigating me and the IRS agent who is in the affinity to the BCCI searches. That was something that not only happened to me, but also happened to many other people who tried to work on behalf of the government, and in particular a citizen who showed tremendous courage to allow the government to use his business as part of their cover, who later became a victim of malicious statements that were made by the investigators that later led to his financial ruin, and it's a shame that that type of thing occurred, but it did." Now we get to the Black Network. None of the BCCI officers interviewed by the Senate claimed to have knowledge of a black network of intelligence operatives, arms dealers, drug traffickers, burglars, or assassins employed by BCCI as described in a Time magazine cover story on BCCI on August 15th of 1991. They declared to a person that they did not believe such a network existed at the bank. However, several suggested that if the black network were recharacterized as a team of officials carrying out Abedi's most secret missions, then it could exist on a somewhat smaller scale than that characterized by Time, operating out of either BCCI's Pakistani Protocol Department or its Pakistani BCCI Foundation. Now we get into the Sandstorm Report. In March of 1991, the Bank of England asked Price Waterhouse to carry out an inquiry. On June 24th of 1991, using the codename Sandstorm for BCCI, Price Waterhouse submitted the Sandstorm Report showing that BCCI had engaged in widespread fraud and manipulation that made it difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct BCCI's financial history. The Sandstorm Report, parts of which were leaked to the Sunday Times, included details about how the Abu Nidal terrorist group had manipulated details and, through using fake identities, had opened accounts at BCCI's Sloane Street branch in London. Britain's Internal Security Service MI5 had signed up 2 sources inside the branch to hand over copies of all documents relating to Abu Nidal's accounts. One source was the Syrian-born branch manager Agha Hasan Abedi, the second a young British employee. The Abu Nidal link man for the BCCI accounts was a man based in Iraq named Samir, and I'm going to butcher this name, Najmedin or Najmedin. Throughout the 1980s, BCCI had set up millions of dollars worth of letters of credit for Najmedin, largely for arms deals with Iraq. Qasim later wrote in an affidavit that Najmedin was often accompanied by an American whom Qasim subsequently identified as the financier Mark Rich. Rich was later indicted in the United States for tax evasion and racketeering in an apparently unrelated case and fled the country. Qasim also told reporters that he had once escorted Abu Nidal, who was allegedly using the name Shakir Farhan, around town to buy a tie without realizing who he was. This revelation led in 1991 to one of the London Evening Standard's best-known front-page headlines, quote, "I took Abu Nidal shopping." Now we get into who Abu Nidal was. In the United Kingdom, a key window of BCCI's support of terrorism was an informant named, as I mentioned before, Qasim Qasim, the former manager of the Sloane Street branch of BCCI in London. Qasim had given the accounts of Palestinian terrorist Abu Nidal at BCCI, and then proceeded, while at BCCI, to provide detailed information on the accounts to British and American intelligence, apparently as a paid informant, according to press accounts based on interviews with Qasim. As of 1986, the information obtained about Abu Nidal's use of BCCI was sufficiently detailed as to justify dissemination within the US intelligence community. In July of 1987, as a result of the information provided by Qasim, a State Department report concerning Abu Nidal and Qasim, declassified in 1991 at the request of the subcommittee, describes Abu Nidal's use of BCCI. The A&O commercial network comprises several businesses created over the past 7 years with the long-term goal of establishing legitimate trading enterprises in various countries, gaining experience in commercial trade and making a profit for the group. The general manager of the commercial network and the principal agent in grey arms transaction is Samir Hassan Najem El-Din Samir Najmedin. He has directed many of A&O's commercial activities, both illicit and illicit, from his offices in the INTRACO building in Warsaw, Poland. He has maintained a general account at a major Western European bank, BCCI in London, from which he transfers money to individual company accounts at local banks. He maintains joint control of each company's ban records, ban accounts, along with the company manager, and he is responsible for forwarding all major contracts to Sabri Al-Bana for final approval. I'm so sorry if I get any of these names wrong. Following dissemination of this material by the US coordinated efforts to shut down the financing of the activities expressed in its targeting of Abu Nidal through BCCI London, with some success. Other terrorist groups continued to make use of BCCI, including one state sponsor of terrorism and the Qassar brothers Manzoor and Qassam, who have been associated with terrorism, arms trafficking and narcotics trafficking in connection with the government of Syria and with the provision of East Bloc arms to the Nicaraguan Contras in a transaction with the North/Secord enterprise paid for with funds from the secret US arms sales to Iran. Now we come to Manuel Noriega and his role in BCCI. General Manuel Antonio Noriega and his family deposited at least $23 million into several secret numbered accounts at the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, and then shifted the money from country to country to keep their mounting personal wealth hidden, a former banker for the deposed Panamanian leader testified to. The banker, Amjad Arwan, a 44-year-old Pakistani who ran the Panama branch of BCCI in the early 1980s, said General Noriega made individual cash deposits as large as $3.4 million into 4 secret bank accounts he maintained for personal use. Beginning with an initial deposit of $100,000 in January 1982, General Noriega made large deposits every 2 or 3 months until early in 1988, when he was indicted by 2 grand juries in Florida on charges of cocaine trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. Sometime in the middle of 1983, Mr. Awan said the general asked that his accounts be moved from Panama to BCCI branches in London. Quote, "We thought we would maintain greater confidentiality in London," claimed Mr. Awan. End quote. Mr. Awan, who continued to oversee the general's finances after he was transferred by BCCI to Washington and Miami, also said that in September of 1984, the bank agreed to lend $400,000 to the general to help him buy an apartment in Paris. The loan was paid off in less than 6 months, mostly by the interest occurring in the general's 4 main bank accounts at BCCI. As a colonel in the Panamanian Armed Forces in the early 1980s, General Noriega would have earned a salary of about $30,000 a year. Even after he became Commander-in-Chief of the Panama Defense Forces in August of 1983, he would have been paid an official annual salary of about $50,000. In questioning Mr. Awan, who is serving a 12-year sentence in a federal prison for money laundering, Assistant United States Attorney Michael P. Sullivan did not try to link General Noriega's wealth to the cocaine trafficking and money laundering payoffs that witnesses in the trial have said they paid to him. In fact, the jury was provided with no explanation of how General Noriega got the money. Frank Rubino, the General's chief counsel, suggested in court papers filed before the trial started in September that General Noriega had been paid at least $10 million by United States intelligence agencies, and that some of the money found its way into his personal accounts. After that indictment was handed down in February of 1988, Mr. Awan said General Noriega telephoned him and asked that the British accounts be closed and that the deposits, which at the time amounted to $19.3 million, be transferred back to Panama. Mr. Awan said he convinced General Noriega that he would be better off moving the money to a branch in Luxembourg because that country had more banking secrecy than Britain. But 6 months later, General Noriega and his wife, Felicidad Cierro de Noriega, moved all their BCCI assets, a total of $23 million, to banks in Zurich and Hamburg, Germany. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Awan said the money was shifted to a commodities and stock exchange brokerage in London that was run by a friend of the banker and then to yet another bank. Now we come to the secret purchase of the first American bank. The Central Intelligence Agency said that it prepared a report in 1986 stating that the Bank of Credit and Commerce International acquired control of Washington's largest banking company in 1982. Government officials outside the intelligence agency said information on First American Bankshare Inc.'s ownership was distributed at the time to the state and treasury departments and possibly to other agencies. The CIA report is important because it shows that government agencies had clear warning that the rogue international bank secretly owned First American. Officials at the Federal Reserve have said they would have never permitted BCCI to own an American bank if they'd known about it. Federal Reserve officials said that they did not remember seeing the CIA report in 1986. The Federal Reserve and other authorities have said they could not document the foreign ownership of First American. Clark M. Clifford, the prominent Washington lawyer and Democratic advisor who is chairman of First American, has said he was unaware that foreign interests controlled the company. In a 100-page report, central bank investigators contend that the BCCI brought control of the 3 American banks in Washington, Georgia, and Florida by passing funds to a group of Arab agents who acted on behalf of BCCI. There is no evidence, however, that BCCI's ownership influenced the operations of First American or compromised its safety and soundness. What is significant from a regulatory standpoint is that the CIA calls into question the vigilance with which American bank regulators monitored the ownership of the bank, which has operations in Maryland, Virginia, New York, Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, as well as Washington. A Senate subcommittee obtained the report, and the chairman, John F. Kerry, D-Mass, got the intelligence agency to declassify the part dealing with the Washington bank. Kerry issued this statement, quote, BCCI's secret ownership of First American was illegal and in direct violation of the conditions under which an Arab group purchased the bank, yet despite the fact that a number of US agencies were told about the secret ownership of First American by BCCI, apparently no one did anything about it. The question is why, end quote. The government also had earlier evidence that First American was owned by BCCI during a Customs Service investigation of money laundering in Florida by BCCI, which led to a guilty plea by BCCI. An official of the international bank, Amjad Awan, confided to US agents that First American belongs to BCCI. Board members of Washington's largest bank told a House panel that they were unaware of Bank of Credit and Commerce International's secret ownership, and the BCCI did not control the bank's decisions. Members of the Housing Banking Committee expressed skepticism at the testimony of the 5 members of First American Bankshare Inc.'s board. The board members said they did not know that Middle Eastern investors who bought First American in 1982. The Federal Reserve has accused the investors of acting as frontmen for BCCI in the purchase. But the panel produced a number of documents, including a 1986 internal First American memo about BCCI that committee members said showed considerable ties between the Washington Bank and BCCI. Quote, some of the same investors that own First American Bankshares Inc. also own BCCI, and as a result, First American Bank is often referred to as being like one of us by its officers, end quote, the memo said. Now we get into the forced closure of BCCI. BCCI was awaiting final approval for a restructuring plan in which it would have re-emerged as the Oasis Bank. However, after the Sandstorm report, regulators concluded BCCI was so fraught with problems that it had to be seized. It had already been ordered to shut down its American operations in March for its illegal control of First American. On the 5th of July 1991, regulators persuaded a court in Luxembourg to order BCCI liquidated on the grounds that it was hopelessly insolvent. According to the court order, BCCI had lost more than its entire capital and reserves the year before. At 1 p.m. London time that day, 8 a.m. in New York City, regulators marched into BCCI's offices and closed them down. Around 1 million depositors were immediately affected by this action. On the 7th of July 1991, Hong Kong Office of the Commissioner of Banking, forerunner of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, ordered BCCI to shut down its business in Hong Kong on the grounds that BCCI had problem loans, and the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, the major shareholder of BCCI, refused to provide funds to the Hong Kong BCCI. Hong Kong BCCI was liquidated on the July 17th of 1991. A few weeks after the seizure, on July 29th, Manhattan District Attorney Robert, and I'm going to butcher this name, Morgenthau, announced that a Manhattan grand jury had indicted BCCI, Abedi, and Naqvi on 12 counts of fraud, money laundering, and larceny. Morgenthau, who had been investigating BCCI for over 2 years, claimed jurisdiction because millions of dollars laundered by the bank flowed through Manhattan. Also, Morgenthau cited BCCI's secret ownership of First American, which operated a subsidiary in New York City. Morgenthau said that all of BCCI's deposits had been fraudulently collected because the bank misled depositors about its ownership structure and financial condition. He described BCCI as the largest bank fraud in world financial history. On the 15th of November, BCCI, Abedi, and Naqvi were indicted on federal charges that it had illegally bought control of another American bank, Independence Bank of Los Angeles, using Saudi businessman Gahath Farhan as the puppet owner. Just a month later, BCCI's liquidators, Dell PwC, pleaded guilty to all criminal charges pending against the bank in the United States, both those lodged by the federal government and by Morgenthau, clearing the way for BCCI's formal liquidation that fall. BCCI paid $10 million in fines and forfeited all $550 million of its American assets, at the time the largest single criminal forfeiture ever obtained by federal prosecutors. The money was used to repay losses to First American and Independence and to make restitution to BCCI's depositors. None of this was enough to rescue both banks. However, Independence was later seized in 1992, while First American was forced into a sale to First Union in 1993. Many of the major players in this scandal have never been brought to trial in America or UK courts. Abedi, for example, died in 1995. He was under indictment in the United States and UK for crimes related to BCCI, but Pakistani officials refused to give him up for extradition because they felt the charges were politically motivated. Even without this to consider, he had been in poor health since suffering a stroke in the 1980s. Farhan remained a fugitive until his death in 2017. In 2002, Dennis Roberts and Ernest Backus, former number 3 of financial clearinghouse Clearstream, discovered that BCCI had continued to maintain its activities after its official closure, with microfiches of Clearstream's illegal unpublished accounts. Now we get into the American inquiries and legal actions. In 1991, Robert Mueller declared the government had been investigating BCCI since 1986, resulting in intense media coverage. In 1992, United States Senators John Kerry and Hank Brown became the co-authors of a report on BCCI, which was delivered to the Committee on Foreign Relations. The BCCI scandal was one of a number of disasters that influenced thinking leading to the Public Interest Disclosure Act, PIDA, of 1998. The report found that Clifford and his legal/business partner, Robert A. Altman, had been closely involved with the bank from 1978 when they were introduced to BCCI by Bert Lance, the former director of the Office of Management and Budget, to 1991. Earlier, Farron was revealed to have been the puppet owner of National Bank of Georgia, a bank formerly owned by Lance before being sold back to First American. It had previously been FGB's subsidiary before Lance bought it. Clifford and Altman testified that they had never observed any suspicious activity and had themselves been deceived about BCCI's control of First American. However, the federal government and Morgenthau contended that the two men knew or should have known that BCCI controlled First American. Farron also was revealed to be the puppet controlling owner of Trust Bank in Miami, Florida. Morgenthau and the federal government brought indictments against Clifford and Altman, but did not pursue Clifford due to his age and deteriorating health. He died in 1988. Altman was indicted and tried in New York, though he was ultimately acquitted following the jury verdict of not guilty. Altman later accepted a de facto lifetime ban from any role in the banking industry to settle a civil suit by the Fed. Now we get into the British inquiry and litigation. The British government set up an independent inquiry chaired by Lord Justice Bingham in 1992. Its House of Commons paper, Inquiry into the Supervision of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, was published in October of that year. Following that report, BCCI liquidators Deloitte Touche filed suit against the Bank of England for £850 million, claiming that the bank was guilty of misoffence in public office. The suit lasted 12 years. It ended in November of 2005 when Deloitte withdrew its claims after England's High Court ruled that it was no longer in the best interest of creditors for the litigation to continue. Deloitte eventually paid the Bank of England £73 million for its legal costs. According to news reports at the time, it was the most expensive case in British legal history. Now we get into the litigation elsewhere. Although major litigation has ended in the case, suits and legal actions relating to the bank were still being brought in 2013, over 20 years after the bank's failure. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions podcast. Until next time, next on Unanswered Questions. The Clinton body count is a conspiracy theory that asserts former US President Bill Clinton and his wife, former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, have secretly had their political opponents murdered, totaling as many as 50 or more.